Ambassador Greminger, thank you so much for being with us. And let's start talking about a very sensitive issue, which is the war in Ukraine. And what is your feeling? What is your thoughts? What was the reason for this war? Why that has been started?
I think there are two overlapping conflicts. There is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, indeed, but perhaps more importantly, there is an ongoing conflict, I would argue, since the end of the Cold War between Russia and the West. And a history of mutual disappointments, of perceived mutual broken promises. And I think it's these two overlapping conflicts that are at the root of what we are currently seeing, but both of them would not justify the war. It would not justify, military aggression against a sovereign country by the Russian Federation.
Definitely, but could we speak about some kind of responsibility from the Western side? I mean, frequently Russia speaks about the NATO enlargement, and that the NATO enlargement is somehow this threat to its sovereignty and security. How much it is based on some kind of reasons?
Look, for me, there are legitimate security concerns by the Russian Federation. And I think a major power like Russia, would want to have a buffer zone of friendly states around itself, states where, you wouldn't position military infrastructure that could threaten it or any of its major cities. I think this is a legitimate concern. Of course, the question is, at the end of the day, what has been triggering the decision to attack Ukraine militarily? Was it really a security concern, or was it not much more an imperial ambition? Was it, a conception of the history of the region, that is very revisionist in nature. And while, I would have an understanding for legitimate security concerns and also, for the dilemma between security principles, the principle of the right of any state to freely choose its security arrangements, as opposed to the principle of the indivisibility of security, so that you shouldn't expand your own security at the expense of another. And applying these two principles on the states that happen to be geographically situated between the Russian Federation and the NATO, produces an obvious dilemma, and I think that needs to be addressed. But obviously, I have much less understanding for imperial ambitions, for revisionist policies.
Okay, but if we are talking about the somehow the legitimate issues from the Russians' perspective of its security and stuff like that, how much the big powers they keep the international law when it comes to their security, when it comes to their interests?
Look, from the point of view of smaller states, obviously international law, that is the fundament of international relations. But it's true. I mean, what we would observe also in the recent history is quite a selective interpretation by major powers of obligations of international law. I mean, they happen to interpret international law very much in their favor.
Definitely. So, on one hand, we are facing the really tremendous damage to one country. I mean, Ukraine. On the other hand, there is the sanctions and serious consequences for Russia itself. What is the seeable actually the consequences for both of them? Is there any kind of scenario which you can elaborate somehow with this?
I think what we can already see is that this disastrous repercussions of this war in many ways. Of course, the humanitarian consequences, the destruction in Ukraine, refugees and displaced persons, more than 14 million had to flee their homes. But then also, you know, what I'm afraid we all will be confronted with something like a Cold War 2.0 once the hot war is over, with a deep freeze in political relations between Russia and the West. This trend of dividing economies, a more Western and a more Eastern economy, I'm afraid will be reinforced. And then not to speak of the European security order. I think deterrence will dominate this security order for the foreseeable future. I think the last bits of cooperative security are gone, and it will take a long time to kind of rebuild the necessary trust to bring some, you know, of the cooperative approaches back to a European security order, and I think that is not an encouraging future.
You mentioned some problems which are from the European perspective. So in that regard, when we are speaking about the economy consequences, humanitarian consequences, and etc., so many problems facing Europe right now from out of this war. Why Europe is not a leader of settlement of this process? Why they are not moderating? Why they are not active? Where is the European leadership, I mean, in this process to somehow to settle the problem, somehow to stop the war?
Well, first I would perhaps acknowledge a strong, perhaps even unexpected European unity in response to the Russian aggression. And I think a unity that has also translated into strengthening, you know, institutions, the European Union, NATO for that matter. You know, after the disaster in Afghanistan, I think NATO appears stronger than ever. So in that sense, what we are seeing is a strong Europe, but of course, totally broken ties between Europe and an important part of Europe, the Russian Federation.
You know, it seems like that Europe is waiting for Turkey or China or someone else to solve the problem instead of being really seriously active in it.
Look, I've been for a long time very active in mediation, and if I have learned one thing, is you need the parties' political will to engage a third party in. And I think for the time being, there is just no appetite by the parties to have a truly impartial mediator in. I think what we see is some power mediation by Turkey. I'm not sure, though, to what extent they're really in, you know, and to what extent they're really impactful in not to speak of steering the negotiations that are for the time suspended. So I think at the end of the day, it's a matter of the parties. Do they want to have a mediator? They definitely perceive, you know, institutional Europe, that is the European Union, as party to the conflict. So they will never gonna ask them in. But generally speaking, you know, major powers have a tendency not to rely on any third party in conflict resolution. because this would imply losing control, giving influence, power over an important process to a party that you can't control fully.
Mr. Ambassador, I would like to move towards the issue of neutrality. So we are facing right now that Switzerland, for instance, has elaborated its own sanctions against Russia. Is it possible for stable future that Switzerland could help with arms to Ukraine or something like that? And where is the neutrality of Switzerland today?
I think generally neutrality seems to be a very dynamic topic these days. On the one hand, you see traditionally neutral countries turning towards NATO, like Sweden and Finland. On the other, you see neutrality potentially being imposed on Ukraine. At least this is being currently discussed. And then you're absolutely right. There is a very vivid discussion on neutrality in my own country, Switzerland. Look, I've experienced neutrality to be a very dynamic concept. I think it's not static at all, and Switzerland's perception of neutrality, I think, is a case in point. Not so long ago, Swiss were of the opinion that they could not join the UN because this would not be compatible with neutrality. Today, Switzerland is one of the most active UN members. Speaking about sanctions, until the late 80s, early 90s, Switzerland had a major conceptual issue with adopting sanctions. This changed, and from basically 93 on, Switzerland systematically adopted international sanctions, with the notable exception of 2014, when Switzerland chaired the OSCE, had a mediating, facilitating role in the conflict, and therefore decided not to adopt all the sanctions. Part of them, yes, to prevent a circumvention of sanctions through Switzerland, but not all. This time, it was so clear that Switzerland would have to adapt the full package of sanctions because this was such a blatant violation of international law. And after all, international law is the best friend of a country, of a relatively small country like Switzerland.
You mentioned this Finland and Sweden supply to NATO for the membership. So recently, there was in the Turkish media, Anadolu, your comment about that. On one hand, this is kind of that they're the wheel, and it's okay. It's understandable why they're doing that. On the other hand, you mentioned the new Iron Curtain. How much we are facing this real possibility of Iron Curtain and the new Cold War, which you mentioned also 2.0.
Clearly, I totally understand the Finns and the Swedes, being geographically so close to the Russian Federation, that with Russia's current behavior, that they're simply afraid, and then reconsider their neutral stance, and they have now concluded, and I find this understandable, they have concluded to submit their membership requests to NATO. Seen from a European security perspective, this clearly deepens the divide between Russia and the West. That is obvious, and this fear of a new Iron Curtain emerging is clearly it's very visible for me out there, and this is not the Europe that I would work for. But again, I fully understand it.
So, is Europe ready for the new Iron Curtain?
Well, I think, look, a lot will, of course, depend on how this war ends. So we are still speculating.
I will add, especially with this globalized war, the Iron Curtain, where after the World War II was the different issue, different circumstances. Now, with this high interdependence of all the countries, how much is it possible, and how much is it ready for that?
It's true. There is a totally different degree of economic interdependence. We are in a multi-stakeholder, in a multi-polar world, so it's not just Russia or the Soviet Union and the United States. You have a number of additional actors, and particularly one huge, very powerful actor, and that is China. So that is different. But still, when I look at Europe, when I listen at current political discourses, when I look at current political patterns of behavior, I'm afraid this reminds me very much of the Cold War that I have still, experienced, and this scares me. But it's true; it will be different, and we'll also have to see to what extent this is going to be kind of the West against the rest of the world. Or will it be a relatively isolated Russia with a very few friends? That is obviously the vision of the West. When you currently try to assess realities, for instance, at the UN in New York, you start doubting, that this is going to happen. But if I look at voting patterns in the UN, I see a divide, a clear divide, and I think if we allow this divide to deepen, we might find ourselves again in something that is very different to Cold War 1.0, but will remind us on some very significant features of it.
And don't you think that this is the really serious issue which should be addressed right now to prevent division of the world into 2 or 3 pieces which are competing to each other really seriously, dramatically, and they can damage to each other seriously?
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that the UN Secretary General Guterres already addressed 2 years ago in his speech at or was it 3 years ago at the General Assembly, where he kind of warned us all about this trend towards a divided world. Obviously, the easiest way would be to end this war as quickly as possible, and with some sort of a ceasefire that can be perceived, by all major stakeholders as relatively fair. If this is not going to happen, I guess we will have to try very hard to compartmentalize relations. Not to forget about the ongoing war, but still try to address other issues, security issues, other global challenges. Take climate change, but also other security challenges, like for instance everything related to this strategic stability dialogue agenda, that is nuclear, hypersonic, non-proliferation, space, emerging technologies. All these issues need to be addressed, and this would oblige us to somehow also separate different fields of relations.
So let's go back to the neutrality. Does this issue still alive? Since Finland, Sweden would like to join NATO, since the discussion of this issue started in Switzerland, in Austria, and etc. Does this the live idea?
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you that in Switzerland there is a discussion on how to interpret modern neutrality policy, but there is clearly absolutely no political intention to fundamentally question neutrality in its core, in its legal core. I think this is, I'm pretty sure you will have extremely solid majorities to maintain that. So when it comes, for instance, to supplying arms, I think there is a clear a limit there. At the same time, when it comes to being in solidarity with the international community concerning sanctions, when it comes to being active, trying to resolve conflicts, to be a bridge builder, etc. I don't see any limits, imposed by a modern interpretation of neutrality.
Since you were the Secretary General of OSCE, do you feel right now, after the war in Ukraine, after the NATO's refusal to respond militarily towards the nuclear power, I mean, Russia, that the security architecture should be rethinked, as for instance, Putin was demanding in 2007?
I think the security architecture need to be reconsidered. I mean, this will more or less automatically happen because right now we are confronted with a security architecture that is exclusively dominated by the concept of deterrence. Now, at some point, we might want to reintroduce elements of cooperative security, and for this to happen, we need to have a new understanding of the principles of European security, European security cooperation, and European security architecture. I wouldn't argue that we need to reinvent the wheel. But we would definitely need to get to a new understanding of what principles that we have agreed to, for instance, in the Helsinki Decalogue or in 1975 or in the Charter for European Security in 1999. We need to come again to a common understanding what these principles mean today, and how we deal with all the dilemmas, that are obvious between the different principles. So simply saying, let's recommit to the old principles is clearly not enough. And I think this would automatically lead to a security architecture that is different from the one that we have seen before.
So finally, Mr. Ambassador, let's go to an end. And your personal vision, where we are right now, the world, global world, is it really, as some of the international relations experts say, that the end of the liberal hegemony and start of the multipolarity and etc., or there is any kind of scenario?
I think we've been living in a multipolar world for quite some years, and I think multipolarity and respecting principles of European security are not a contradiction. So I think what we gradually, I think we need to come again out of a foreseeable future dominated by deterrence to a period where we want again to talk to each other and to reintroduce some cooperative elements of security. And I think I don't see multipolarity as an obstacle to that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador.
You're most welcome.